Wrapping up the first day of early signing period here in Gainesville, and Scott, Dan Mullen has another really good signing class.
He does. It's a class that's going to finish in the top 10 in the rankings. And even though he just told us that he's not big in the rankings, he wants to see it translate on the field. That's his rankings that are really important. It's the first time, Shelby, since 2012 through 14 that Florida will have finished with the back-to-back class that's ranked in the top 10 of the recruiting services. That's progress. And, there's been a lot made since Dan Mullens got here to kind of get back to that elite recruiting that the Gators did in his first tenure here as offensive coordinator. And they're certainly taking steps in the right direction. He was asked directly in his press conference about, are you building a roster that you feel confident it can be a championship caliber team? And he says, we're getting there. He kind of hesitated like all coaches would. You don't really know about these cycles or these classes until a couple of years. But, when you start putting classes back to back in the top 10 and your team, has another chance to finish in the top 10 of your national rankings, certainly that's a sign that things are heading in the right direction. I think the early signing period is just another indication of that.
Well, we've seen that a lot with Mullen, that he said his rankings are not like other people's rankings, and he develops these guys, and I think we see that again in this class.
Yeah, he has a track record of good evaluations. The name that everybody loves to talk about is Dak Prescott, a very undervalued quarterback coming out of high school. And, of course, we all know his story now. He's one of the faces of the NFL. At Florida, you just look at this class, Shelby, a guy he mentioned, Travis Johnson, the defensive back from Bartram Trail High School over in Jacksonville. Not a lot of people were not on him at all on the recruiting cycle, yet Florida was on him early. And then suddenly he gets a lot more attention later in the cycle. And, other schools make offers, and he held to Florida because they saw it first. And I think that's really the core of Dan Mullen and his staff's philosophy, to show these players early in their high school careers when they really think they have the potential they could play at Florida, and just build that relationship from scratch. And that's kind of the way this class is unfolded.
Well, and Coach Mullen said when I talked to him and in the press conference, it's because they recruited high character guys. And he gave credit to not only his coaching staff, but his recruiting staff, that's the kind of guys they went after to make sure there are no surprises, and he wants commitment to mean something.
Yeah, I think you see it so often. That's why National Signing Day kind of has the reputation it does. It almost becomes a circus act for some kids. You hope that it doesn't for many, because that's not the way that a fan base or a player probably is going to be best served to start off his college career, floating around and just taking the last suitor. You want kids who really know about your program, who understand what your staff is about, what your team is about, what the culture is like in the program. And the only way you really get that, Shelby, is through time. It's not something that you just get overnight. You have to work at it. You have to build those connections. And Mullen talked about it again during his press conference that, the first year they came in, they were kind of flying around just trying to close the class. Last year they got a top 10 class. Now they've done it again. He's constantly made some changes on the recruiting side of things behind the scenes. They've added support personnel. They've changed some just ways, philosophy maybe in the way that they get on kids early, and some of the systematic approach. And it's paying dividends, but it all goes back to what you were asking about, the relationship and just taking the right kind of kid that you can envision having long-term success.
So Scott, you mentioned Johnson, but another one of those guys who verbally committed in fall of 2018 was Jervon Dexter, and he never wavered, and lo and behold, today he fully signed to be a Gator.
Yeah, I think he could almost serve as a poster child for this class in some way. That high character guy who Florida showed interest, kind of a guy not necessarily off the radar, but certainly not in the mainstream as some of your top prospects are early in the cycle. Florida showed interest, built a relationship, and this is a player who he's a basketball player, didn't really start playing football until the final couple of years of high school. And from all accounts, I haven't seen him in person myself, but from talking to the coaches and the recruiting staff, this guy just has a presence about him physically when he walks into a room that you're probably going to look at him like, man, that guy's only 18. But that's the reality. He's one of those developed guys that they hope can come in and do something big at Florida.
Well, Mullen was even asked in the press conference which one of these 21 guys is going to be an athletic freak, and Mullen said all 21 of them. If you're coming to the University of Florida, you're obviously already a special athlete.
Yeah, I mean, when you're putting top 10 teams on the field, and you have the tradition that Florida has, I mean, you're going to get great players. Even during this decade, I was looking this up the other day. I mean, Florida, even though maybe on the field it hasn't been, some of the seasons have been down, they still rank third this decade in producing NFL players. That means you're getting a lot of freaks, as we like to call them. Dan Mullen will take 21 freaks anytime. We'll know more which ones really fit that bill in a couple of years, but that just shows me he really likes the diversity of this class. He likes the athleticism. He likes the development potential. It's a class that you look at it on paper, Shelby. They really beefed up this year. I mean, they had to beef up on the defensive line and on the offensive line, and that's really a focal point. And then on the flip side, they really added a lot of players in the secondary, 6 players in the secondary to go along with some young players that we saw this year. So it's building depth at some key places, and now what they'll look for in a National Signing Day in February is to maybe polish it off with some of the areas maybe that they didn't get today on offense.
Well, let's talk about the line of scrimmage and some of the guys that Florida got on both the offense and defensive lines. I mean, Mullen said to compete for a championship, that's what it comes down to. You have to have aggressive and competitive lines.
Yeah, I mean, this is the SEC. It's one of the oldest cliches in the SEC that it's a line of scrimmage league. You hear coaches all across the South say that, but it's true. I mean, that's why Alabama, that's why Georgia, that's why LSU is playing, potentially for national title. They have great lines up front. So it's a line of scrimmage league, and by this list that we're looking at here, Shelby, a lot of these names are fitting the bill. Lamar Goods, Johnny Brown up front. You mentioned Jervon Dexter. They picked up some help up on the defensive line with 4 players. Offensive line, I think they signed 3 today. Of course, a couple of these guys, Joshua Braun is already on campus practicing. Those are players that I think, with where the program is right now, that these names we could hear some next season. Some of these guys, I think that's the plan.
And 6 guys signed in the secondary there. Coach Mullen, he's really excited about these new DBs.
He is. I mean, they're losing obviously C.J. Henderson at cornerback, Jawan Taylor at safety. I'll just look. We've already mentioned Trayvon Johnson. Just talking to the recruiting folks about him, they told me that his film is probably as impressive as any player that they've evaluated in a couple of years. I mean, they really like him, and again, he was undervalued early in the recruiting cycle. Another guy, Ethan Pouncey from Winter Park High School. Name sounds familiar. Obviously, it is because he's the second cousin of Mike and Marquise, and he's coming in with his brother, Jordan Pouncey, a transfer receiver from Texas. But Ethan is going to come in right away and, get a look in the secondary. Played a lot of cornerback. And then from there, it's just Avery Helms, a kid from Missouri City, Texas, who I know they like, a kid who's played offense and defense in high school, projected as a defensive back at Florida. So it's just those young guys mixed in with some of the guys they have. And then you're talking about some veteran faces who'll be back. And, Brad Stewart, Donovan Steiner, names that we're familiar with. Marco Wilson's still out there. We don't know exactly where it's going with him, but again, a position of need. And I thought that with 6 guys, that's a pretty big haul for any position on one day. So when I saw that number, that jumped out at me.
When it comes to special teams, fans have become very used to hearing Townsend.
Yes.
And I know Gator Nation is very sad that another Townsend punter won't be coming in, but you can get excited because Florida has signed an Australian punter, which will be pretty exciting. Coach Mullen did not go to Australia, he confirmed, but they have a lot of really good kicking academies over there. And now Jeremy Crawshaw is a Gator.
The first Gator to sign in this class, actually the first player I think maybe in the country to sign, because he sent in his, whatever they do these days, I know we still call it fax, but Dan Mullen actually joked during his press conference that they all do it by phone now. But he sent it in, Shelby, at 3 p.m. yesterday on Tuesday. But of course, in his hometown in Australia was 7 a.m., so he was ready to get signed. And he's a little different. A lot of these Australian punters come over, they've all got kind of unique stories. Some of them have been like 27, 28 years old. Now, he graduated high school in December of 2018, so he's more of your traditional age. He's going to come in, looking to have 4 years, but with Tommy Townsend departing, and of course Johnny before him, and since their parents Clay and Susan have no more sons unless they're hiding them in the closet, Jeremy Crawshaw will have a chance to come in and compete for a job. And it's an interesting story. It's a fun story. Dan Mullen was asked obviously about that. They didn't really go over to Australia to recruit him. Greg Knox, a special teams coach, and some of his support staff have contacts over there at this Pro Kick Australia, a kicking academy over there that's pretty prominent and has produced 5 Ray Guy Award winners since 2007. So that tells you right there why these schools are looking to Australia for the punters. Not only are they coming over, but they're producing with some good results, and now the Gators have their first one.
Scott, you talked about Dak Prescott earlier on. Well, Gators signed a quarterback today, Anthony Richardson, from right here in Gainesville. The first time Florida has signed a quarterback from Gainesville since 1996. And Coach Mullen is excited about him because he said, we have a guy with a tremendous arm right here in our backyard.
Yeah, it's a rarity. I mean, it's a kind of a unique thing. I talked to Anthony about that. I'm going to write about it this week, about what that's like growing up in Gainesville, Florida. He moved here when he was about 6th grade, 7th grade, moved from Miami, really settled down here. Obviously, when you live in Gainesville, you're going to have a natural connection to the Gators, or you're certainly going to know about them. Started coming games here in middle school, and then he started to blossom on the field really as a sophomore in high school. And he's already here practicing with the team. And I can tell you just from, I think Kyle Trask, he's already called him a stud just from what he's seen. Big arm, very athletic. If you look at him on paper and his skill set, he's got kind of the skill set that Dan Mullen loves in his quarterback. He can run, he can throw, he's big, he's physical. A young guy, he's going to come in and with Kyle Trask and Emory Jones learn a lot from those guys, but getting him in as an early enrollee is huge, and having him going through these bowl practices here before the team goes down to Miami, that's such a plus for a guy's development. And his high school season, senior season, ended with injury, but he's fully healthy now and just really ready for this next opportunity. But I think a lot of Gator fans may have already saw him play at Gainesville Eastside High School if you live locally, but now he's going to be showcased to as what we call Gator Nation, right? A lot more people.
Just a few.
Just a few.
Anthony isn't the only signee from this area. Mullen gets 13 guys from the state of Florida, possibly 14 later on tonight. And that's huge. He said, when you grow up in the state of Florida, you should grow up wanting to be a Gator.
Yeah, when he was here the first round, Florida was dominating the state in recruiting. That's got to be a focus of your coach at Florida, because you are the premier program in the state of Florida. If you're winning at the pace that Florida is used to, you're going to have some of the premier talent from Florida on your roster. I think we're starting to see that trend go back to the way that a lot of us, like my age, actually remember. Florida, so many great players have come from this state over the years to the Gators, and they're starting to do that. Like, as you said, 13 of the first 21 in are Florida kids, and within the 5-hour radius of Gainesville that he talks about, that extends all the way down to South Florida, but it also extends into part of the Carolinas and Georgia, Alabama, maybe even the corner of Louisiana. So that's their focal point, getting that radius. But it all starts in Florida, and to me, that's just another sign of we saw it on the field this year, Shelby. They beat Miami, they beat Florida State for a second consecutive year. You start winning the games on the field, suddenly your program becomes more attractive, and that leads to the players, the best players in your state, wanting to come to your school. And I think that's the momentum that has really helped Dan Mullen in this class and last year's class.
Scott, one of those guys you have to be excited about is Jonathan Odom. His dad played here, and he'll be a good addition to the squad.
Yeah, I guarantee his dad is excited. Jason Odom, who, for Florida fans who actually went to school here, like I did when his dad played back in the mid-'90s. That's when the Gators were rolling under Steve Spurrier. Really good offensive lineman, went on to play with the Tampa Bay Bucks for a while in the NFL. His son, Jonathan Odom, is a tight end at Tampa Jesuit, signed with the Gators today. And I saw that it was he's excited because I saw him already quoted about this class. He says this is the class that's going to help the Gators win another national title. And his dad was a part of a team that, certainly played in the national title game, I think his last year, and then won it the next year. But so, you always like to have one or two guys on your roster who have some kind of connection really deep to the program. They call it the legacy connection, because you have a guy like that on your roster and he understands maybe the culture, the history of a program more than some of the players who are either just too young to remember or didn't grow up huge fans of the program. He can help kind of build that understanding in the locker room. So I think that's why it's important in some ways, but it's also important that Jonathan Odom's a really good tight end, one of the best tight ends in the state, and we all know Dan Mullen likes to tight end in his offense. We've seen how Kyle Pitts has developed and produced in the last 2 years. So if I'm Jonathan Odom and I'm playing tight end in this offense, I'm pretty excited too.
Well, Scott, another successful early signing period for Coach Mullen, and we'll be back here in 6 weeks talking about it when we have the traditional signing day. But before then, we will see you in Miami, Gator fans.